Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah, amma ba'd. Jazakallah khair, Ayub, for that introduction. As Ayub mentioned, this will be an online webinar named Darwinism 2.0, The Changing Face of Evolution. So what I'm going to be covering today is three basic points. The first point is that science is revisable, meaning its conclusions can change. And I'm going to be explaining why that is the case. The second point, which follows on from the first point, is since the Darwinian mechanism is a scientific conclusion, it is also not an exception. It can also change. Its conclusions are also revisable. They are provisional. And then I'm going to be going over some of the problems for the Darwinian mechanism which current academia is facing. So firstly, science is based on observation, and you take a limited set of observations, and from them you conclude for the unobserved. So Europeans, for a very long time, all of the swans that they observed were white, so they concluded all swans are white. And later they discovered some swans were black. So this is known as the black swan problem. A new piece of data came in which overturned a previously long held belief. Now this is a very simple issue in science, that you will always get new data which will go against your previous conclusions. And because scientists are always limited to the observations they have at hand, and they always infer, they always assume about the unobserved, new data can come in and it can radically change the picture that we're actually looking at. Now, if you study the history and the philosophy of science, this is well known. The sad thing is that the majority of the public, and even some people who are seen as academics, they don't actually realize this. They think science leads to truth. Scientific conclusions are concrete, they're never going to change, and this is simply not true. The black swan, if it's taught us anything, is new data can come in which can totally revise our current understanding, or you can have a different interpretation of your existing data. Now, if you pick up any book on the philosophy of science, whether it's by Oxford University Press or Cambridge or whatever, you're going to get the same sort of explanation from philosophers of science. So Samir Okasha, in the philosophy of science, a very short introduction, he basically says you look at every single basically field in science, and you look at the current theories that as we have them today, and you look at those which existed 50 years ago and those that existed 100 years ago, you will see they are radically different to what we have today. And also Philip Kitcher, in the philosophy of science, a new introduction, he says the same thing. You know, scientific conclusions can change. Using words like scientific proof is actually dangerous, because scientific conclusions are not written in stone. And the history of science has always shown us that conclusions that we believe are concrete, they're not going to change, they can actually change. For example, in chemistry, there was the phlogiston theory, and this theory helped us discover nitrogen. And later it was discovered that phlogiston doesn't actually exist. And in biology, we believe the Neanderthal man was our direct ancestor. And in the end of the 20th century, after some DNA testing, biologists revised that previous conclusion that they'd held for 150 years and said, actually, no, the Neanderthal man is not our direct ancestor. And in physics, we have, at the beginning of the 20th century, Newtonian physics had been working well for over 250 years. We had developed technologies based upon it. We had, taught it as fact in schools, and so much knowledge was gained based upon Newtonian mechanics. And Einstein came along and showed actually time and space is flexible, and he gave a completely different view of the universe. And Newtonian physics was superseded by Einsteinian view of the universe. And that was a big paradigm shift that happened at the beginning of the 20th century. So whether you look at physics, whether you look at chemistry, whether you look at biology, it doesn't matter if a theory has been working for a very long period of time. It doesn't matter if people call it a fact. New data can come which can radically change that conclusion, or a new interpretation on the existing data can give us a radically different theory. So, is the Darwinian mechanism absolute truth? Well, if you look at documentaries, if you look at the sort of magazines, science popularizers who are out today speaking about Darwinism and who say things to the effect of, if you don't basically believe in evolution, you're either ignorant, stupid, or insane. And you have these fantastic drawings showing an ape-like creature slowly morphing into a human being, and you have a whole school system and university system which teaches that this is just true, this is just absolute truth. But since, if you look at the history of science and the philosophy of science, we know this sort of language is not actually appropriate, because science can change and its conclusions are revisable. So imagine you are in a situation where there is a lecturer and he's just given a 3-hour explanation about the Darwinian mechanism. And he speaks about, for the last 150 years, Darwinism has been working, we've discovered new knowledge, we have so-and-so fossils, and these show our direct linkage with other primates like, apes and monkeys. We have, junk DNA, we have the molecular biology revolution, we have XYZ, all this information, and he basically says it's true and it's not going to change, and whoever challenges it is wrong, and blah blah blah. Imagine at the end of this lecture you raise your hand and you say, excuse me, thank you very much for that presentation. I mean, I don't mind accepting the Darwinian mechanism as a working model, but to speak about it in absolute terms, I don't actually believe is correct. I think a lot of the things that you've just described are very speculative. They're based on assumptions, and there's a lot of disputes on the data that we actually have. Now, in the current climate, you can imagine what sort of reaction you'd get from a professor or from a science popularizer if you use these sort of terms to describe the Darwinian mechanism, speculative, based on assumptions and disputes. And they will not allow you to basically say you can accept it as a working model. They'll say, no, you have to accept it as absolute truth. Well, as I'm going to be going through this presentation, you're going to see that these words, speculative, assumptions, and a lot of disputes on the data, this is actually from mainstream academics and people who don't actually have a religious bias. So just some quick terms of engagement. All of the people I'm going to be citing are not going to be intelligent design proponents or people who believe in, young earth creationism or something like this. They're going to be secular, mainstream. They believe in naturalism, and I'm going to be referencing from peer-reviewed journals like Nature, Science, and others. Now, as soon as you start speaking about, issues within Darwinism, you get a whole host of these self-defense mechanisms that neo-Darwinists have, which basically pop up. So the first thing is you're being anti-scientific, you're challenging science, look at science, it works, we have medicine, we have this, we have that. Well, actually, to claim a scientific conclusion is concrete and it's never going to change, and that Darwinism is an absolute fact, that is actually anti-scientific. Because we know, because of the black swan, because of the problem of induction, you can get new data which can go against previous conclusions. To speak about any scientific conclusion as if it's an absolute fact, that is in fact anti-scientific. You're going to come across what I would call word games, where basically it's like basically baiting and switching. They'll speak about, well, we know macroevolution is true because we have this. And what they're actually referring to is actually microevolution and loads of other sort of word games that you'd come across in from neo-Darwinists who believe that this is absolutely true. And, people are going to try and, confuse you with technical jargon. Well, we have a certain number of smell genes which are actually switched off, which are still on in dogs. And look, at the end of the day, every human being has the right to question, has the right to knowledge. And what we should do is not try, if somebody has genuine questions, not try and hide behind technical jargon, just get to the point. And what I'm going to be going over today is for people who have no background in biology. That's why many of the concepts that I'm going to be going over are going to be explained in a very simple way. So if someone tries to bamboozle you with technical jargon, you know that they're actually hiding something. And one of the things you get is, but you don't have a PhD. How can you challenge Darwinism? You don't have a PhD. You're not a doctor. You're not a professor. Well, there's a simple reply to that. I have a brain. And that's enough. And if you are not willing to accept someone who doesn't, or listen to his views, who doesn't actually have a PhD, then Charles Darwin didn't have a PhD. So don't believe in Darwinism. And many of the people I'm going to be quoting today are mainstream academics who do actually have PhDs, and they have serious doubts about the Darwinian mechanism. So don't allow someone to insult you by saying you don't have a PhD so you can't question this. You don't need to have a PhD to question or understand the conceptual differences and the advantages and disadvantages of the Newtonian and the Einsteinian worldview. Another sort of self-defense mechanism you get is, well, why don't you attack other theories? Why are you attacking Darwinism? Why don't you attack general relativity or attack, something in chemistry? Well, what you would find in other sciences is people don't hold on to a theory as a religious belief in the same way that people do in biology. And actually, people do question general relativity and other theories. Another thing you get is there's a scientific consensus. How can you challenge a scientific consensus? All the scientists agree this is true. Okay, firstly, let's assume there is a scientific consensus on the Darwinian mechanism, and every single biologist in the world today believes it's 100% true. Even if that's the case, it doesn't mean that it's absolutely true. There was a consensus, 100% consensus, on the Newtonian worldview at the beginning of the 20th century, and it worked for 250 years. And we even went to the moon based upon Newtonian mechanics. No one expected what Einstein proposed, general relativity, and space and time being dynamic. And Newtonian mechanics was absolutely true, was a fact, and as new data came in, that whole worldview changed. Nothing in physics made sense except in light of Newtonian mechanics in the beginning of the 20th century. And some would argue nothing makes sense in biology except in light of evolution. That still doesn't mean it's absolutely true, because we've seen in the history of science, you get paradigm shifts. You get huge changes in worldview in fields of science. And for someone who wants to find out more about this, look up the works of Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he goes over how you have paradigm shifts throughout the history of science and why we actually have them. Another self-defense mechanism, but it works. Great, it works. Chemistry, the scientific fact or theory of phlogiston worked. It helps us discover nitrogen. Newtonian mechanics worked. It helps us go to the moon. But it doesn't mean that those things are absolutely true. They're working models. Phlogiston didn't actually exist, but it helped us discover nitrogen. Newtonian mechanics isn't absolutely true, but it helped us go to the moon. So just because it works doesn't mean it's absolutely true. Another thing you hear is only religious people object. That's not true. There's no other naturalistic alternatives besides Darwinism. Okay, let's assume that's true. Does that mean we can't challenge it? Of course not. Now, the interesting thing is that change is actually expected. Even science popularizers, science journalists like Richard Dawkins, even though they may say, if you don't believe in evolution, you must be ignorant, stupid, or insane, he does admit in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, that new facts may come to light, which is the black swan problem, which may force our successors of the 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. So the fact of the matter is, even though his popular rhetoric may be, it's absolutely true, it's never going to change, it's a fact, even he himself admits, well, new facts may come to light and we may abandon it. Okay, just a quick distinction between evolution and Darwinism. Evolution is simply change in the biological world over time. Okay, this was known before, from the time of the ancient Greeks, from the time of Aristotle. You have many of the ancient Greeks speaking about this evolution. You have, the Chinese speaking about evolution. You have within even the Arab world, Muslim scientists speaking about evolution. So the evolution has been known for a very long time. Things change, things evolve. There's a big distinction between evolution, which is an observation in nature, and the Darwinian mechanism or Darwinism. Evolution is simply change in organisms over time, change in the living species over time. Darwinism was a history of evolution and a mechanism by which it actually happened. And the mechanism was that you have natural selection working on random mutations, and over the history of the Earth, you have this gradual change from the last universal common ancestor, which was the first cell. And from the first cell, you slowly get a branching, beautiful tree. And this is very famously known as the tree of life. Sadly, these two things get confused. People speak about Darwinism and evolution as if it's the same thing. I mean, evolution as it was known before Darwin, that's not really a problem for theism, religion in general. The Darwinian mechanism did conflict with some aspects of religion. And just a quick example of bait and switch, which is what I spoke about earlier. You'll find these popular pictures which you'll get on famous atheist Facebook pages or books or articles, and they'll say evolution is just a theory like gravity. That is a big problem here. Evolution is an observation like gravity. that's not really a problem. Evolution is not a theory, it is an observation. The theory is the theory of natural selection that Darwin proposed. So what the people are doing here is they're conflating the two terms. And as you can see in this picture, you have a professor or a school teacher saying, I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact. And what he observes is actually evolution of, say, butterflies or bacteria or E. coli or whatever. And the child's thinking to himself, oh, he's seen a mammal, a fish slowly turning into a primate, These are two different things, and you're going to find this throughout the neo-Darwinist literature. They keep playing these word games, switching over from evolution to Darwinism and speaking about them interchangeably, but we must make a distinction. So I'm just going to be going over some quick general biological problems for Darwinism. Now, Darwin believed the tree of life was a discovery in the origin of species, and by the way, the origin of species is slightly misleading for the layman, because Darwin doesn't actually speak about the origin of species. He speaks about the development of life. He assumes that, he doesn't go over where the first cell came from, or where the first cells came from, or where life came from. He just speaks about how, if it was there, then how it could have developed. Now, the tree of life idea has been taught as a scientific fact, a brute fact, for a very long time. Anyone that studied biology would know this. And interestingly enough, according to the biologist Ford Doolittle, and the tree of life was as important to Darwin as the theory of natural selection. Now, in the late 1990s, because of something known as horizontal gene transfer, this whole idea of the tree of life came into question. And in a paper that was published by the biologist Ford Doolittle in a peer-reviewed journal, he basically concludes the tree of life cannot properly be represented as a tree. And it's interesting, you hear this all the time. Well, if you don't believe in Darwinism, publish a paper. Well, there's actually loads of papers which question the fundamental aspects of neo-Darwinism. So when people say something like that to you, you know they're not actually aware of what's going on in biology. And on the top right there, you have the biologist Carl Woese. He discovered the third domain of life, which is archaea, and is taught in every single biology textbook in the entire world. One of the most important evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. And again, he thinks life may be more like a web than a tree. And on the bottom left there, we have the geneticist Craig Venter. He's won the American National Medal of Science, which here Obama is giving him. And prior to that, the President Bill Clinton gave him one in, I believe, the late 1990s. So a very important biologist. He's been, according to Time magazine, he is the top 100 most influential people in the world. And again, from a genetics point of view, not because of horizontal gene transfer, he basically thinks the tree of life is not the correct description. There may be a bush of life or a web of life or something like that. And all these three people, who are very important biologists, are all atheists. And they're questioning the central idea in the origin of species, which is the tree of life. And if you pick up any book on the philosophy of biology, there's a really interesting book by Peter Godfrey Smith, which was published by Princeton University, and he basically speaks about, many biologists now are speaking about a web of life rather than a tree of life. And when we were at school, taught that natural selection, working on mutations, had created all of the diversity of life that we have today. Now, obviously, natural selection, we observe it. We observe it in E. coli. We have the famous Lenski experiment. But natural selection as a creative force to create novel organisms, this is something which mainstream secular academics question. So Lynn Sagan, the biologist, who again won the National Medal of Science in America. She is an atheist. Her her theory of ensymbiotic theory is taught in every single university in the world, and she doesn't believe in neo-Darwinism. She doesn't believe natural selection creates novel organisms. She says, when they use these sophisticated computer programs to show you, you need this many mutations to get from this organism to that, she says it's numerology. It's not really science. And likewise, you have people like the biologist James Shapiro, who also doesn't believe natural selection is capable of doing what many neo-Darwinists say that it can do. We have the gene-centered view, which Richard Dawkins popularized in the 1970s, that natural selection works at a genetic level. And the interesting thing is, in 2010, the biologist E.O. Wilson published a paper in which he challenged the selfish gene idea with multi-level selection. And, you had this huge battle going on in biology between a very well-respected scientist, E.O. Wilson, and Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, he wrote a review of E.O. Wilson's book, and he listed all the scientists that agreed with his worldview of the selfish gene. And E.O. Wilson replied, well, when is science a democracy? And this is the problem that many people don't actually understand. Science is not a democracy. If all the scientists agree something is true, it doesn't mean it's actually true. And outside observers, speaking about this issue between the selfish gene and multi-level selection, they say things like, the whole reputation of evolutionary biology itself is at stake, because this was one of the most important central ideas in biology for a very long time. It was taught as an absolute fact. This is now in question. And, this actually shows the inductive nature of biology. Then we have the central dogma of molecular biology proposed by Francis Crick, the biologist who discovered the structure of DNA. He won a Nobel Prize for that. And again, he's an atheist, a mainstream academic, and he came up with the central dogma of molecular biology. And in 2010, I believe, a paper was published by the biologist James Shapiro, and he showed how the central dogma is violated at many points. Again, this shows you, no matter how many biologists agree on a aspect, on a conclusion, it doesn't mean that it is immune from future discoveries which may go against this conclusion. Now we're going to be going over some interesting sociological problems for Darwinism. Now, according to the whole idea of the selfish gene within neo-Darwinism, we're basically selfish beings that only care about our own survival and reproduction. Everything, including our communication, is manipulation for survival and reproduction. And you get this very ridiculous idea that everything in terms of human behavior can get broken down in terms of survival and reproduction. You even find biologists who speak about rape as a mechanism which the losers in society adopt to pass on their genes. But if you go and interview a whole bunch of rapists around the world, the last thing you'll probably hear is, I was just trying to pass on my genes. So this idea that everything, our morality, our civilization, our self-restraint, all faces of human expression are broken down in terms of survival and reproduction, this idea itself doesn't make sense. And one of the most clearest reasons why it doesn't make sense is because human beings are not just selfish. Human beings are kind. We actually care about each other. We, to the detriment of ourselves, sometimes want to save humanity. We give charity, we give food, we have institutions to help others. Now this goes against the whole selfish gene idea and this whole we're all just selfish and we're all in it for ourselves. If you want to see a physical proof that the selfish gene idea is basically nonsense. Just go visit your local hospital. That is one building which is designed for the survival of the unfittest. And from a neo-Darwinist point of view, it doesn't actually make sense. Now, neo-Darwinists come back and they try and defend themselves against the problem of altruism, the problem of kindness. And you'll find in their literature they speak about kindness and altruism and these things in inverted commas because they believe it's a veneer, it's a veil beneath which you're actually just selfish. So the idea of kin selection was put forward to try and explain human kindness and altruism. And the biologist J.B.S. Holding put it in a comical way. He said, I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. Now, what this basically idea is, you share genes with your kin, so you're only helping them because you're selfish, because if they survive, they'll pass on your genes. Now, that doesn't actually make sense. In many human beings help people who they're not related to. And if I am actually helping someone who's related to me because I'm actually deep down selfish, because I want them to pass on their genes, then why don't I know that? Why does a evolutionary biologist have to write a paper to try and explain that, and the fact that I don't actually know deep down I'm actually selfish? And then you have the idea of reciprocal altruism, that it's basically I scratch your back, you scratch my back. If you're good to someone, if you're going to help them survive and reproduce, they're eventually going to help you survive and reproduce in some way. Again, why don't people know that? Why is it that a biologist has to come along and say, actually, this is your intention. You're being good because a mother's being good to her child because the child holds her genes, or the child is going to be good to her in the future. Well, why doesn't the person know that? And why is it that we help people anonymously? And there's no way they could repay us because we give charity many times anonymously. So kin selection and reciprocal altruism isn't enough to explain away human behavior, in particular altruism. You can't take all of our consciousness, our art, our mathematics, language, morality, and take all these things and try and reduce them in terms of survival and reproductive value. It doesn't work like that. And a simple way of understanding how this idea of reciprocal altruism and kin selection is not enough to explain human behavior is if you look at the interaction between a mother and her child. According to Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, it is to a mother's advantage if her child's adopted, because then she can raise another child and that way more of her genes are passed on. But which mother in the world would like to give up her child and have it adopted so it is freed up to have more children? Where will you find that? Now we're going to be going over some major problems in human evolution. And again, if you pick up a book by any academic who's honest enough to actually admit this, you're going to find the sort of language which I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. And this is by Michael Kent, the biologist, who's written a book for Oxford University. And he speaks about human evolution as being very speculative, based on very little evidence, not being complete or undisputed. But going back to my example at the beginning, if you say that to somebody who just delivered you a lecture in biology, or after watching a documentary with someone, you say, speculative, it's based on assumptions and disputes, you're going to get, strange looks. You're going to be like, what are you talking about? This is absolutely true. But you will never find these words being used in documentaries on History Channel, PBS, or Discovery. Inconclusive. You'll find as you go through the literature, when biologists are speaking about our own human origins, they'll say stuff like, there's various interpretations, it's fragmentary, we don't really know the actual origins of our species. Now I'm just going to be going over a quick example so that you can understand why biologists do what they do in terms of human evolution. In the beginning of the 20th century, a tooth was found, and this tooth wasn't exactly a human tooth, wasn't something which made that much sense to biologists, except that it must have been a early ape human like creature which lived a very long time ago. And they believed that this creature was the ancestor of modern humans. So using this tooth, they made up this whole idea of the Hesperonychus halkuki, and I'm pretty sure I pronounced that incorrectly. So this picture was actually drawn from this tooth that they found, and as you can see here, this man, he is a somewhere in between a human and an ape. You can see he's got a tool in his hand. He's possibly got his wife next to him. He's got some animals in the background. And this whole picture was actually drawn from a tooth. It was later discovered that this tooth wasn't a human tooth. It actually belonged to a skunk pig, I believe. So this whole idea of a ape human man was based upon a single tooth. Now, why is it that biologists, very intelligent people, based a whole story based upon such little evidence? And the reason is there is a priori, meaning before experience, assumption in biology of methodological naturalism. Basically what that means is every single thing that biologists study has to have a natural origin. In fact, this is a general thing in science. Every single thing that scientists study, they look for naturalistic explanations. So they cannot accept the human being arrived in the history of the earth without being linked to something else. This is an assumption which is prevalent all over the world. The way Gareth Nelson, the curator at the American Museum of Natural History, the way he puts it is, we've got to have some ancestors, we'll pick those. Why? Because we know they have to be there and these are the best candidates. Now, if you go up to any biologist who believes in human evolution, they can't disagree with this statement. Even if there was no fossil record, even if we didn't have the molecular revolution in biology, even if we didn't have any of this, we would still, according to methodological naturalism, according to this assumption in biology, we'd have some ancestors, simply because human beings cannot have just sprung out of nowhere. They must have had a prior ancestor. The way the biologist Richard Lewontin puts it is, materialism, as in naturalism, is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And both these guys are atheists, both these guys are naturalists, and the thing which is interesting about them is they're very honest. They're very honest. They're basically saying, look, we're forced by our assumption that they are only material causes. So human beings could not have come in the history of life without being linked to something else. So they can accept human beings evolved from X, or human beings came from X, where X is something naturalistic. But the religious idea that mainstream theism holds, that human beings were created by God at a particular time, this will never be accepted because of the a priori assumption of naturalism. Now, there's alternative theories in human evolution. There's the idea of panspermia put together by the atheist biologist Francis Crick, and also by Richard Dawkins, which is that Darwin didn't speak about the origin of life or the origin of species. He spoke about the development of life. So panspermia is the idea that life came down to Earth and it was sent down by a possibly advanced civilization in other parts of the universe. So this life came down to Earth and eventually it developed all over the world. So that's a theory which is accepted in biology because it's naturalistic. We have the aquatic ape theory. So the standard theory that you'd see when you're on Discovery, when you're watching Discovery Channel, is you have a ape-like ancestor which came off the trees, started walking on two legs, as in became bipedal, and then over time slowly became human. The aquatic ape theory says, no, actually we have some very unique characteristics which are very different to other primates, and we have webbed hands, we're mostly hairless. If you put a chimp in water, it'll sink to the bottom, but a human baby can swim. So what they say is we had an ape-like ancestor, it came off the trees, went into the sea, the water side for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly millions, then came back, and then they have a different alternative history. Again, this is something which is accepted in biology as a valid alternative because it's naturalistic. In 2013, there was a conference in London in which Donald Johanson, the discoverer of the famous Lucy fossil, David Attenborough, and others came together to discuss this idea. So this is a valid idea in biology. Then we have the pig-chimp hybrid, and this idea is basically we're not just descendants of apes and humans, so we're not just descendants of an ape-like ancestor. There was a chimp that mated with a pig, and that created the human line. This was put together by the geneticist Eugene McCarthy, a hybrid specialist. He's published with Oxford University, and this guy is he's a secular academic, and he's come up with an alternative hypothesis of human evolution. Again, that's allowed within biology because of naturalism. And there's certain characteristics that human beings have which other primates don't actually have. Our hearts are very similar to pigs, also other parts of our bodies. And so what he basically says is we're not just, linked to the chimps, we're also linked to pigs. Now, all of those naturalistic ideas are out there, alternatives out there, but the mainstream idea is that we had an ape-like ancestor, which was a tree-living creature, and it came off the trees, slowly became bipedal, and you have this sort of picture which you get in textbooks, magazines, and so forth. And the interesting thing is that biologists agree that this human evolution, this line from a Lucy-like fossil, a ape-like fossil, to human beings, which is over a period of millions of years, this line, we don't actually have hardly any evidence for this. And the reason is fossils are very rare. It's like lightning hitting a spot. And because they're so rare, we have very little evidence of this supposed human evolution. One of the paleontologists, one of the papers that was published in Science, he basically mentions that, look, it's kind of like working out the plot of War and Peace, which is a book by Leo Tolstoy. I believe it's 550,000 words. And he says, look, it's trying to work out the plot and the contents of War and Peace using 13 randomly selected pages. Now that's quite a statement, and that just goes to show you the extent at which you have, just how little data you actually have, and how many rival interpretations you can actually have within naturalism. And this whole idea of missing link, that we're humans, apes exist, if we find a fossil which is a bit like a human, a bit like an ape, there we go, human evolution's true. This is nonsense. Anybody that studies this stuff at an academic level knows there's no such thing as a missing link. The vast majority of life that's ever existed in the history of the world has not fossilized. We may have, according to the philosopher John Wilkins, millions of missing species, potentially millions of missing nodes. We don't actually know, maybe an indefinite number of missing branches. And again, he's a philosopher of biology, atheist, and if you imagine those videos that you get on YouTube where someone takes a picture of themselves every single day and they put it on YouTube and they take it over a period of, I don't know, 30 years, and you see a slow, gradual change in their face over that 30 years, and you get these, to make those videos, you need thousands of pictures. And if you imagine every picture is a fossil, you basically need, for human evolution, you need millions and millions of fossils, from the ape-like Lucy fossil to the anatomically modern humans, us. We don't have those millions and millions of fossils. We hardly have anything. This is why it's very dangerous when you come across these videos on YouTube where you have an ape-like face turning into a human-like face over a period of maybe 2 minutes. They show millions of years of evolution. If that video is to be scientifically correct, they need to have millions of fossils. They don't. And the reason they don't is because fossilization is a very extremely rare event. So it's very misleading when people speak about the missing link, which many neo-Darwinists do. When people speak about, in the beginning I showed the picture of an ape-like person turning into a human-like person. These things are very misleading. The biologist Henry Gee, he's a paleontologist and the senior editor of Nature. Again, he's an atheist and he's a secular academic. And he basically puts it in a more colorful way. He says, no fossil is buried with this birth certificate. And you can't basically take a line of fossils and say, this is the cause, this is the effect, this is the ancestor, this is the descendant. This is not even a scientific hypothesis. He compares it to a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Now, it's not me who's saying this, it's the biologist Henry Gee and many other atheist secular academics, because we don't have hardly any fossils. And he, in his book, The Accidental Species, Misunderstandings of Human Evolution, he, attacks this picture that we see and we've been seeing for the last 150 years of an ape-like thing turning into a human being, and this progressive view of human evolution. He challenges this it's linked to the old idea of great chain of being and so forth. So you have a lot of, very important people in biology who are very honest, who actually say, you can't actually do this. This isn't actually even scientific, even though he himself does believe in human evolution. And the biologist Gareth Nelson, professor, what he basically says is the same thing. The fossil record sounds impressive and authoritative, but you can't just take a bunch of fossils and say this is the ancestor, this is the descendant, because we don't actually have those fossils. And he says, if you try and do this, it's an illusion or it's a superstition. It's, you have so many different interpretations, and it's these sort of pictures that you see in the bottom right hand, these are very misleading pictures. Unless you already believe it's true, and then you find fossils and you're like, oh, this is secondary evidence. If you already believe it's true, then what's the point of even finding fossils? You have this very famous experiment in 1975 by Wilson and King, in which they showed that humans and chimps are 99% similar. Now, in Elliot Sober, the professor of biology, philosopher of biology, in his book Evidence and Evolution, published by Cambridge University Press, again, he's an atheist, what he basically says is, even if it's 99% human chimp DNA, it doesn't mean common ancestry is absolutely true. just because there's similarity between humans and chimps doesn't mean they have a common ancestor. You can infer that. It may be a plausible explanation according to naturalism, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily true. But the interesting thing is humans and chimps don't actually share 99% DNA. This is a big, I would say, myth, which is propagated all over the world. What scientists basically did is they compared the human DNA to the chimp DNA, and they discovered that 2.4 billion letters matched and 1.3 billion letters did not match. So what they did is they ignored the 1.3 billion letters which didn't match, and they only compared the letters which matched, which was 99%. Now you may think to yourself, wait, that doesn't make any sense. So they compared the two sets of DNA, they ignored 1.3 billion letters which were different, and then they said the rest is almost identical, it's 99%. Now, you may think to yourself, why did very intelligent, sincere, honest biologists do this? The reason they did this is because they assumed human-chimp ancestry is true. They do have a common ancestor. So all of the differences, they deleted. So you can't use the 99% chimp DNA argument because it already assumes common chimp ancestry is true. So to try and use it as evidence of human chimp ancestry is circular reasoning. But let me just put things into perspective here. 1.3 billion letters which are different in humans and chimps. That's equivalent of, if you imagine there's 130 million books in the world today. Of those 130 million books, if you put them together in an area, you can imagine the number of books that they are. Now times that by 1,000. That's every single book in the world. That's 130 million books. Times that by 1,000. That's the number of letters which are different between humans and chimps. And interestingly, just a few years ago, in a paper published in Science, again a peer-reviewed journal, the biologist John Cohen, him together with other biologists and geneticists, what they basically say is this myth of 1% that's all over the world, this isn't actually correct. And according to Savante Pabo, a chimp consortium member based in Germany, what he basically says is you can't actually work out, because we don't know that much about DNA, you can't actually work out the percentage difference between any two living organisms, let alone humans and chimps. It's hard to quantify humanness versus chimpness. Why is that? It's because of missing DNA, extra genes, altered connections in gene networks, and the very structure of chromosomes. And what he basically says is, I don't think there's any way to calculate a number. So you can see that this very popular argument, and you see these atheists wearing these shirts, 99% chimp, very proudly, you can see that they haven't actually seen how the scientists came to their conclusions, and they don't actually understand the implications or how they actually came to that 99% similarity, and they don't even understand that this is no longer valid. I mean, even John Cohen, who's an atheist, and together with the rest of the biologists, they don't even take this seriously anymore. Now we're just going to be going over some famous icons of evolution. Now Lucy, this very famous fossil, you know, she was put on Google later last year. You know, President Obama went and he basically visited her in Ethiopia when he was there last year in 2015. And if you look at the fossils, you'll conclude exactly what the discoverer Donald Johanson and other biologists basically say. She is very chimp-like or ape-like. There's nothing about her that you can say is human-like. So why is it that they say this is a human ancestor? Well, they say it's a human ancestor because the pelvis, according to some, shows indications that it walked on 2 feet. Because it walked on 2 feet, they say it must be a human ancestor. Now, like I mentioned previously, you can't claim something to be an ancestor and say that this is scientific because we don't have the gradual change from an ape-like creature into a human being. We don't have those fossils. But if you already believe it's true, then this fossil is interesting. If you already believe human-chimp ancestry is true. But even from that perspective, biologists don't agree that she walked on 2. Some believe she knuckle walked. And these pictures that you find, these can be very misleading. The hands of Lucy look very human-like. Chimps have very long fingers. But if you look at the fossils, there is no hands. The feet of chimps are very similar to human hands. They have opposable thumbs. Now her feet look very human. Now if you look at the fossils, there's no feet. So if you already believe human evolution to be true, if you already believe human chimp ancestry to be true, Lucy can be something interesting. But you can't use it as evidence of human chimp ancestry. And the interesting thing is, biologists have discovered an ancient ape which lived in Italy about 10 million years ago, which was fully bipedal, meaning walking on 2, and they agree this ape has nothing to do with human evolution. So even though there may be an ape or a chimp, and you already believe human evolution to be true and human chimp ancestry to be true, even then, if you find a chimp-like creature which walks on 2, it doesn't mean it's a human ancestor. So you can see a lot of this, even though it's based on speculation and assumptions, is still disputed. Now, this famous fossil, Ida, this was put on Google in 2009. You had a press release about this fossil. You had documentaries made. You had a book that was published, a website. If you go and put Ida fossil in Google today, you'll come up with close to 500,000 hits. Now that's very interesting for a fossil to be that popular. And this thing was showcased all over the world. David Attenborough in a documentary said about, in a video said about Ida, you know, it's not about imagination, it's not about suggestions, it's fact, it's true, it's a missing link. If people say, you know, how we link to apes, this is the missing link. And as we know, the whole idea of missing link, according to secular academics, is nonsense. But it had so much appeal, this human ancestor. The paleontologist John Hurum, he said, you know, this is like finding the Holy Grail. It's going to be in the textbooks for the next 100 years. National Geographic called her the critical missing link. Others called her the 8th wonder of the world. But again, like we've mentioned, this would only be an interesting find if you already believe human evolution to be true. We already linked to other primates, and then this would be interesting. But just after all the media circus was over, it was discovered that actually Ida Darwinus has nothing to do with human evolution. This was in a paper published in Nature, which is the most prestigious journal in the world. So the millions of people that were exposed to this fossil, they're still in the dark. They believe that Ida is something important when she is not. Now we're coming to the end of the presentation. I'm just going to be going over vestigial organs. Vestigial organs, this idea was popularized by Charles Darwin. What this is you have some organs in your body which if you take away, it makes no difference because they're evolutionary byproducts from the time that we were linked to other primates. Now, the appendix was a classical example of a vestigial organ, but just a couple of years ago it was discovered actually the appendix, other than the previous functions it's known to have, it also flushes the body with good bacteria, and so it does have a very critical function. The famous coccyx is labeled as a tailbone. When we were primates, and it's basically a useless vestigial junk organ. Now, if anybody really believes that, then they can go to A&E, they can get their tailbone, if that's what they want to call it, or their coccyx removed, and they'll discover they won't be able to sit down or walk properly. So these very famous ideas of vestigial organs, these are very much in dispute. And even the atheist biologist Stephen Scadding, in a paper that he published, he also says that there's no special evidence for the theory of evolution in these vestigial organs. You can see there's a lot of dispute in these ideas which we are actually taught are facts. Now, this was known as the ultimate forensic evidence of Darwinian evolution. 97% of the human DNA was termed junk, useless evolutionary byproduct of millions of years of human evolution. And if you look at the billions of human beings that are alive today, and 97% of their DNA is junk, this was used as irrefutable proof of the Darwinian evolution. Now, the biologist Francis Crick, he said, much of the DNA is junk, and it'll be silly to try and look for a function because there is no function. 97% of it's junk, only 3% of it's functional. And the philosopher Philip Kitcher, he basically says, most of the DNA is junk. If it's intelligently designed, then God needs to go back to school. So you can see the atheists, the Darwinists, the neo-Darwinists, they love this idea. It was popularized by Richard Dawkins in his book The Greatest Show on Earth as well. So this idea of junk DNA, this is actually coming under attack now by the studies of ENCODE, the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements. And what they've discovered in the last couple of years is most of the DNA is functional. So this whole idea of junk DNA is now being dropped. And the biologist Nessa Carey, again another atheist, in her book that she published, I believe, just in April last year, because this is, again, biology is very inductive, just like all the other sciences, so a lot of this stuff is very new. And she basically says, this stuff that we used to call junk or rubbish, that we now know that a lot of this stuff can have a very big impact. It's not exactly, the picture is not the way that we thought it was. So what's basically going on in biology? Well, an interesting way that you can think about it is the anthropologist David Pilbeam, he states that our theories are actually, and our ideologies are actually, we can actually read those into the data rather than letting the data speak for itself. And you hear this very popular rhetoric, let the evidence speak for itself. The problem is the evidence never speaks for itself. Evidence always has a spokesperson, and that spokesperson does already have a theory, and that evidence is filtered through that theory. The biologist Michael Rose, in an article in The New Scientist, again, he's a mainstream secular academic, he basically says, look, the complexity of biology is comparable to quantum mechanics. I mean, a revolution can actually come in the same way that we had revolution in the beginning of the 20th century in physics, and that was in the famous 2009 edition, which had the front cover, Darwin was wrong. And what can we as Muslims basically do? Well, like I mentioned right at the beginning, we can accept it to be a working hypothesis. We can accept the Darwinian mechanism as a framework within which we work with, but we don't have to accept it to be absolutely true, because scientific conclusions can change. Its conclusions are revisable. The philosopher David Stove, again, he's an atheist, a secular academic, and what he basically says in his book Darwinian Fairy Tales is Darwin's explanation of evolution, even though it is still the best one available, is not true. Muslims can hold that same view. We can say we don't believe it to be absolutely true, to be absolutely factual, but we can accept it as a working model in the same way that every single scientific theory in the world is a working model. And we can work within that framework and discover new knowledge, just like phlogiston helped us to discover nitrogen. So, in terms of further reading, there's some very interesting books which are written in quite accessible language. James Shapiro's book, Evolution, A View from the 21st Century, and he speaks about the upcoming paradigm potential shift in biology. Then we have the Epigenetics Revolution by Nessa Carey, and this is basically that we can acquire characteristics which are developed. And this is an idea which Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he actually mocked, you know. So just 20 years ago, you know, what he was speaking about with certainty in The Blind Watchmaker is being, you know, superseded. We have Acquiring Genomes, A Theory for the Origin of Species by Lynn Sagan. You know, I cited her earlier, and she doesn't believe in neo-Darwinism. She believes in an alternative mechanism. Darwinian Fairy Tales by the atheist philosopher of science, David Stove, and he goes over many of the sociological problems in biology. And I highly recommend this book because it shows you the confirmation bias and the dogma that many neo-Darwinists actually have, and that objectivity is lost when people come to the data with already preconceived ideas. Then we have Evolution, the Extended Synthesis, and this is a bit more technical, but I think it's a good read, and this will keep you updated with how much this field is actually changing. And all of these authors are atheists. All of these authors are secular academics who are questioning the key components of the modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism. So in summary, science is revisable. You don't need to be Einstein to work that out. Einstein said, you know, no amount of experiments can prove me correct, but one experiment can prove me wrong. Science is revisable. Science cannot prove, it can disprove. So if someone says to you, how on earth are you going to disprove common ancestry when every scientist in the world believes in it? Well, they're assuming it's proven. Science doesn't prove, science disproves. Science is defined by falsification. What? Every single scientific theory has to be in principle falsifiable. Darwinism is not an exception. If you want to speak about Darwinism in a absolute sense, it's no longer science, it's pseudoscience, it's fake science, it's not falsifiable. It has to be falsifiable to be science. And I went over some of the problems for the Darwinian mechanism. Now, I went over a lot of things, but for you to know that the Darwinian mechanism or the Darwinian explanation of the development of life is not an absolute fact. You don't even need to know the problems that I just went over. You just need to understand the first two things. Science is revisable, all of its conclusions can change. Darwinism is not an exception. There can be paradigm shifts, there can be new interpretations of existing data, or there can be new data which can come along which can change our previous conclusions. So in summary, God has the picture, we have the pixel. We have just one small piece of the puzzle. God has the picture. So we can accept Darwinism to be a working hypothesis, a working model. What we shouldn't do is accept it to be absolutely true, in the same way that many secular academics don't believe it to be absolutely true, but accept it as a working model. Everything good I have said is from Allah. Every mistake is from myself. Jazakallah khair for listening. And after a very short 5-minute break, we're going to start the Q&A, inshallah.